And it says the only sacred cow that terrifies politicians more than Canada's vaunted healthcare system is the catastrophic Indigenous affairs system. I mean, to try and address problems with Indigenous peoples in Canada with any plan aside from throwing money at it and offering intergenerational apologies is to invite accusations of racism and garner political ostracization. If politicians can't find the courage to state the obvious when it comes to the mess with Indigenous citizens, then maybe it's time for media members to start this ball rolling. The taboo with this issue must, and if we are ever to dream of seeing improvements, we have to drop that taboo. I've worked in energy exploration for more than 20 years. Much of my time was spent working on or near Indian reserves and working directly with the citizens on them. Watching the condition on those reserves going from bad to worse every year, it was one of the most heart-wrenching and frustrating things I've lived through. There's lots of fantastic people living in those reserves, but they're living in abject poverty and misery, and no amount of money is going to change that. I mean, how stupid can we be, really? How can we possibly think that we could separate a segment of the population based on race, constantly tell them every problem in their life is due to the malignant action of settlers of prior generations, shower them with money, and expect them to become well-adjusted citizens in the modern world? The legal term for these racial enclaves is Indian reserves. That's why I use the term. It's an old, out-of-date term, but that says a lot about what it is, isn't it? The proper term should be apartheid. It's racial segregation, and that's no better than what we used to decry in South Africa. And it won't create racial unity or prosperity any more effectively than the South African model did either. You can't fix the ills created by race-based policies by implementing more race-based policies, yet we keep trying. We need to take a results-based approach with Canada's reserves. Spending on Indigenous affairs, it's been growing in leaps and bounds, yet the situation continues to get worse by every measure. Isn't it time to admit we can't spend ourselves out of this problem yet? The 2024 federal budget, it's a massive free spending endeavor. And despite this, activists immediately condemned it for underfunding Indigenous people. Underfunding, really? Currently, just in federal spending alone, more than $15,000 a year is dedicated for every man, woman, and child of Indigenous descent in Canada. They also get loan guarantees, grants, tax exemptions, free post-secondary education. That's all on top of that. Then the provinces spend billions on top of that, and municipalities with countless programs and grants. This is above and beyond every service granted to them as Canadian citizens. They still also, of course, get healthcare, education, use roads, get full access to all those tax-funded services, as they should. But in theory, this should make Indigenous people the richest, most well-adjusted people in Canada, shouldn't it? Well, instead, they suffer with poverty, lower life expectations, high crime, low education levels, high domestic abuse statistics, massive addiction issues, mental health challenges, suicides. They lag average Canadians in every measure of standard of living. Yet some folks, some idiots, still think we can spend our way out of this. If every Canadian had just spent one day on the average Indian reserve, the national attitude on this system would change in a hurry. How could somebody go out and spend a day looking at the piles of trash, the dilapidated houses, the wild dogs, and worst of all, the broken state of the citizens and residents, and imagine for a second that this system can work? People need to ask themselves, what's the long game? Most reserves are in isolated areas with few economic opportunities. The populations are doomed to lifetimes of dependency, which leads to depression and social breakdowns. The reserves aren't going to become hubs of technological advancement or educational institutions. They're not going to become manufacturing centers or tourist destinations. They're just going to keep growing in population and dependency while disorder and misery spreads. The main employer on most reserves is almost always the government, whether federal or provincial or band administration jobs, and nepotism is rampant among these jobs. Many of them are high-paying but token roles. I worked on one reserve in northern Alberta where the person assigned to manage the band's land affairs was the chief's sister, and she didn't even know where the boundaries of the reserve were until I showed her on a map. Band managers are usually non-Indigenous members brought in at great expense to take care of the actual management of the reserve. The local members, unfortunately, are usually too dysfunctional a condition to take on that role. I'm not shooting at the Indigenous people as a race, though I doubtless am going to be accused of that. Look, any race kept on reserves as Canada's Indigenous people will be just as messed up after a few generations. It's not the race that's the problem, it's this system and the entrenched attitudes towards the issue. Look at the endless debate over clean water and Indigenous reserves. Every government with every party gets hammered on that issue. Don't you think one would invest in getting clean water by now? Actually, they did, and they have, and they do. It's just that their efforts are failing. Bringing water and septic services to rural areas is no small task. In urban centers, you get plants for treating fresh water and disposing of sewage, and it's all connected with pipes for the water and effluent. It doesn't work well in areas where the houses are separated by hundreds of meters, if not miles. In rural areas, and reserves, people have their own water wells outside of reserves and septic systems. Homeowners have to maintain those systems, though, or they're going to fail. The problem on reserves is citizens don't hold a sense of responsibility. They don't have property rights, and they're just, unfortunately, socially dysfunctional. The systems then aren't maintained, and the water becomes contaminated. I don't doubt somebody will accuse me of racism for saying it, but too damn bad. I challenge them to prove me wrong. I'm not saying that people are dysfunctional because of their race. I'm saying they're dysfunctional because the system is breaking them. Until people are willing to point that out, though, it's not going to get any better. If Canada's Indigenous people were living in luxury and happy, I might grumble about the expenditures of taxes, but I could at least accept it. When we spend this much on the issue, though, and they're living in misery, I have to call it out. I don't hate Indigenous people. If I did, I can't think of something more cruel than supporting the current system. The reserve, the system is doomed to failure by its very nature. It won't be easy to end the system, and it's going to take some time, but it has to end eventually. The roadmap and plan to end the policies of racial apartheid in Canada need to be developed. To do that, though, we first need to accept that the reserve system is irreparably broken. To get there, we need to start talking frankly on the issue. We aren't even close to that part yet. Enough with the policies of good intent. We need policies with good outcomes. The best outcome we could see is the end of the Indian reserve system in Canada.